find the passion in something, and also be patient enough to realize that it will come to you. For the most part, you have to have faith that you will find your passion in whatever you're looking to do. That the fates will conspire, and they do. And it might not be what you think it is, but don't shut it off. Take a good look at it, and and you'll be okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio-on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you knew one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now on to my next guest, Larry Neeck. Hi, Larry.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's an honor to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. So, Larry, we were just talking before I started to record that I've known your name going back to my first couple of years as a high school band director. I saw your name on some jazz charts, and so now it's almost 30 years later, and I get to talk to you finally.
Well, that's great.
So, Larry, can you introduce yourself for the listeners? Tell them what you do now.
Well, right now I conduct the Eastman Rochester New Horizons Band, and New Horizons is an organization that was started by my advisor at Eastman, Dr. Roy Ernst, and he basically started it to give elderly people an opportunity to either learn an instrument or come back to a band and play in a band. And so I'm very fortunate to be able to conduct two bands, a concert band and a symphonic band. The concert band is about a good middle school band level. The symphonic band would be like your second high school band level, not the top band. But and so I do that 2 mornings a week. I am obviously a working composer still, so every day I'm writing. I write for C.L. Barnhouse Company through just the fact that I've always written for them, and they basically take what I send them. So I do the composing. I play one night a week in a big band. I'm the keyboard player to kind of keep my chops up and just be able to hear just that music of that era. We do everything from really old stuff to Stan Kenton, Buddy Rich, Maynard Ferguson, with decent players in the band. And I was for 32 years a middle school band director. Actually, I started out as a junior high band director. So I was grades 7, 8, and 9. And then we switched to the middle school around 2000, 2001. And that was a 6, 7, 8 configuration. And I taught in a district. I live in a suburb of Rochester, New York, home of the famous Eastman School of Music, where every band director in town seems to have graduated from that fine institution. And so that's I've been happy in retirement to be able to continue to conduct, and of course I've had wonderful opportunities because of my composing to be able to travel and conduct honors bands and write for different bands around the country. So I really am enjoying myself without the daily grind now.
Yeah. When did you retire, if you don't mind me asking?
I retired 3 years ago, 2016 I retired. So I'm still I'm not a young pup, but I'm not so aged out yet.
So you've had a prolific career as a composer, and you were a middle school band director for 32 years. I bet you we have some things we can talk about here.
Yeah, I bet we do.
So Larry, can you tell everyone how you got started in music? What's your origin story as a child?
I was 10 years old, and I came home from school, and I walked in my living room, and there was a piano sitting there that hadn't been sitting there the day before. And I said, "Oh, wow, what's this? What, do you got me a piano?" And my parents said, "Yeah, we want you and your brother to take piano lessons." And I said, "Great." And no one in my family is a musician. The only stories I've ever heard about my family was that my grandfather on my mother's side, who I never knew because he had passed away, he was an Austrian. And he apparently noodled around on the harmonica and the accordion. So perhaps I got some music talent from him. So I started taking piano lessons when I was 10 years old. And of course, at that time, which was the early 1960s, the Beatles were very popular. And everybody was playing guitar. And so I begged my parents, "Would you please let me take guitar also?" And they didn't want me to do it at first, but we found a really good teacher in town, and he talked to them and said, no, I think he'll be able to handle it. So I started taking guitar lessons once a week too, and I enjoy the whole thing. I remember about the third lesson, we were tuning the guitar, and the teacher called my father in, and he said, he says, there's a way to tune a guitar where you put your finger on the fifth fret and then you match the one string to the next string to tune it. And then there's the way in which you just can hear all the notes in your head and you just tune it. He says, your son can tune his guitar already by himself, and this is only his third lesson. He's got some musical ability. And of course, my father was thrilled. He was always really interested in what I was doing in music. And I was sort of like, oh, really? It's like when you find out you're actually good at something for the first time. And that was how I got started. I had my first gig when I was in sixth grade. We had a quartet, a very bad one, with a snare drummer and three guitars. And we sang, Michael Row the Boat Ashore and 500 Miles. And we must have done a Herman's Hermit song or something like that. And I kind of went from there. And so that's kind of how I got started in music. How I got started in band is even more interesting because when I went to junior high school, I was 12 years old, I went out for the football team. And I decided I was going to play quarterback. Well, I was the second string quarterback on the JV. Yes, so I wasn't it wasn't anywhere near the top of the heap. But I hung in there, and we got to the big game, which was basically an inter-squad game. And the first string quarterback did a lousy job in the first half. And I remember my football coach saying, "Neeck, you're in the second half." And I'm like, "What?" So I promptly threw a touchdown pass and then caught another pass for a touchdown, and we won the game, and it was a big deal. So, of course, the football coaches were right away, "Oh, you're going to be this, you can be on the varsity next year. We'll make you second string quarterback." Well, in the meantime, I was taking music appreciation class in junior high school with a man named Mr. Detweiler. And Mr. Detweiler found out that I played the piano. And he says, I really need somebody to play the bells. And I said, "What are the bells?" And he says, "Oh, it's just like playing the piano." He said to me, good recruiter. And he said, "Would you like to play? You can play. We have a band and an orchestra, and you can play in both of them." And so I thought to myself, sure, I will. I'll be happy to do that. Of course, what it meant was that during football season, we had to march. So I had to make a choice between the band and the football team. Well, I knew I was never going to be a football player. I was smarter than the coaches. I knew myself better. I knew I didn't have a great arm, and I was not small, but I didn't want to get the you-know-what kicked out of me. And so I said, yeah, sure, let's do that. So I quit the football team and joined the band. Long story short. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I never regretted it. And I've never regretted it.
There's a lot of interesting stuff in there, Larry. So then you, as a high school student, you were playing bells. Did you then transition into percussion, or were you still playing piano?
Well, the funniest thing was when I went to the high school, that was 10th grade. You were a sophomore when you went to the high school. I was still playing guitar, and they needed somebody to play guitar in the jazz band. So I said, well, geez, I'll do that. He said, but yeah, your schedule, you can't, you're not going to be able to be in band. You'll just be in jazz band. And I said, well, that's okay. I'll just come in and, I'll come to the practices, because we had marching band practice after school. And then when it comes time for the concert, I'll come to the concert practices. So honest to God, they let me do it. I couldn't believe it. I talked them into it. And so for my first year of high school, I barely played in the band at all. I played with a jazz band. And this was cool because the guy who taught it, Darwin Beislein was his name. He was a sax player. He played around town. We did all these great old arrangements of like 1 o'clock jump. And I mean, stuff that really was being used by the pros, and wonderful arrangements by Johnny Warrington, and which are if you come across a Johnny Warrington, they're classic arrangement for like school bands. And so that's where I really started picking up my jazz ears just by playing that kind of music. And this was when they called jazz bands stage bands. You played for dances. So it wasn't, this was pre-bebop. This was the swing era classic. And so I did. And then my second year, I freed up another period in the day. So I got to do band one period and jazz band the other period. So I was a pretty happy guy. I was able to do music twice in one day. So because we did it every day, and it was a great thing. Altoona Area High School in Altoona, Pennsylvania. That's where I cut my teeth, right there. And I messed around. So of course one day the bass player was absent. So I said, well, let me try it. So I picked up a string bass and messed around with that. And then the piano player was graduating. So I went to Mr. Beislein and I said, hey, would you mind if I switched to piano next year? And he said, no, go, that'd be great. And what I'd been doing is everything theoretical, like chords and stuff like that I was learning on the guitar, I was starting to translate that to the piano. So, because there was no such thing as taking jazz piano lessons back then. You studied with a classical teacher. That was it. Nobody taught jazz. It wasn't done. Musicians learned it in the clubs. So that was another way in which playing the guitar helped me, and being in school music groups as well. So I was getting all the legitimate stuff, and we had a really good concert band. It was a big group. But, we did lots of great music, and it made a big impression on me sitting back there in the bells. I was sort of one step. It was on a tiered band room floor. So I was one step removed from the top of the percussion section, but sort of with the timpanist. So we didn't get in trouble quite as much as the rest of the guys. But, and I got a chance to mess around with the chimes and wind chimes and, all the kind of goofy little auxiliary things that, if you're hanging around a percussion section, they're always lying around. So I think that to this day, that still influences the way in which I write for percussion. To me, it's a very important section in the band. In fact, the most important from the standpoint of rhythm. and I think I sort of just by osmosis absorbed all that stuff, just sitting back there for 3 years, listening to those guys play.
Obviously, you went on to college and you studied music. When was the decision made to go and study music, and where did you end up?
I was the worst music student because, first of all, I hated practicing. I could hear everything, so I could fake my way through anything that came up in jazz band or band. I would just fake my way through it. I wouldn't even read the music. And nobody ever seemed to notice it or mind it. So I was just goofing around, and I was just looking for a school that had different stuff. And again, this was the early 70s. So jazz was starting to be taught in colleges. Electronic music was being taught. And frankly, I wasn't good enough to get in a real music school. So I ended up at the University of Pittsburgh. And the University of Pittsburgh was a cool place because their music department, this was a huge school of probably 25,000 people, but there were only about 100 music majors. And they had a room full of synthesizers. I mean, I had an ARP 2600. We had a Buchla synthesizer. They had a really good jazz guy named Nathan Davis, who had played in Europe, had spent time in Europe. He'd played with Eric Dolphy and Ray Charles, and he knew all these guys in New York. And so he ran the jazz band, and it took me 2 years to get in the jazz band until I was good enough to cut it. And I played in the concert band somewhat, but not as much. That was sort of the black sheep of the department. They were up in the stadium because that's where the band room was for the band, to play at the football games. And they weren't necessarily considered part of the music department. And I also sang with the men's glee club, which was a wonderful experience. And so I ended up at University of Pittsburgh. I spent 4 years there as a music major, graduated on time, and got out. And, well, what am I going to do? Well, I had a girlfriend, and she was from Baltimore. And I'd gotten interested in conducting my last year in college. And I'd actually gone to Duquesne University, had a conducting class. And that's a school that's downtown. But all the schools in Pittsburgh, Carnegie Mellon, Duquesne, Pitt, they had cooperative agreements. So I actually went and took a couple of conducting classes, and I think they were like the ed classes, where we used to call it funny band, where everybody played a different instrument. You played your secondary instrument, and then we'd get up and conduct each other. And I found I really enjoyed it. So I found this guy at the Peabody Conservatory of Music in Baltimore. His name was Frederick Prausnitz. And he was the conductor of the orchestra there. And this guy was a legitimate conductor. He conducted an awful lot in Europe, both the BBC and then in Germany as well. He spoke German. So I talked myself into him taking me on as like a special student because I really had no experience whatever. And I spent 2 years with him. And basically, I learned symphonic repertoire. I never got much of a chance to conduct, which was unfortunate, but that's the way most conducting programs were back then. But he forced us, and there was another guy in the program who was actually in the legitimate master's program. And he was, so we would learn these scores, but he would have us memorize them and then conduct them back to him as he was following the score. And I'm talking about Brahms Fourth, Tchaikovsky Fourth, Dvorak Eighth. It was very challenging, but it taught me how to read a score, and it also taught me how to hear the score in my head. He was very adamant about this, that was the only way if you were going to be a conductor. You had to learn the repertoire. And because you had so much repertoire to conduct, you really had to internalize it. So it was really incredible training. So I spent 2 years with him. And then I flamed out. I said, you know what? I wasn't getting anywhere. I didn't feel like I was gonna, it wasn't working with him anymore. I didn't feel like there was an opportunity. I really just sort of lost the interest, or the just not being part of that. I didn't want to be part of that anymore. So I quit music. I took a job in Washington, D.C., which fortunately was close by, with the National Endowment for the Arts. So for 4 years, I was a government bureaucrat, not doing music. But it was a fun place to work because it was all musicians and artists who worked there. There was mostly, there were no like real government people. This was all being run by, people that either performed or were dancers or singers or visual artists, videographers. And so it was really a kind of a cool place to hang out. But of course, there I met a guy in the jazz program, and he was a bass player. And he found out I was a piano player. So right away, let's get a trio together and do some playing. So there I was, right back in music. And so we messed around, we started taking gigs. And after about a couple years, I think I spent 4 or 5 years at the Arts Endowment. I quit. And I said, that's it. I'm just going to be a musician. So I quit, and I made my living playing piano in Washington, D.C. I would start in the morning. I played ballet classes because that was back when they had live musicians playing ballet. So I'd play a ballet class in the morning. I would go to a restaurant and play cocktail music at lunch. And then at night, I'd either play another cocktail hour or I'd play with a band. So I did that, made my living, but by that time I'd met my wife, and I was starting to see that the music business was not super secure. I'll never forget the day I got a call from my main gig, which was 5 days and 2 nights a week playing cocktail piano. And I got the call from the owner of the restaurant, and he said, Larry, he says, I'm sorry, we're not going to need you for a couple of weeks. We just had a grease fire in the kitchen. So there I was making no music. Well, my wife's father was a teacher. He taught languages, and he taught it. She was from Rochester, and I'd met him, and this is after a few more years, and he pulled me aside one day. He says, look, why don't you be a high school band director? He said, you can still take any gigs you want on the weekend. He said, but you'll have a pension. You'll have you'll have health care. You have a steady income. And he says, you'll probably enjoy working with the kids. And I thought about it, and it made me stop and pause because, I enjoyed playing music, but, when you're playing in a bar, you're kind of using about a quarter of your brain, I mean, seriously. And when you're a teacher, you learn the instruments, you interact with the kids, you're a conductor, you can write or arrange for them, you can play any instrument along with them. There's no restriction. If you got the balls to pick up a French horn, you can play right along with the kids, whether you're any good or not. And so I thought about it, and it made a lot of sense. The smartest decision I ever made in my life. And, back then I didn't listen to anything anybody told me. No. So I ended up, I had to go back and get my education credits. I had a degree in music, but I didn't have the education parts. I needed to get the history and philosophy of education and the methods classes, and that kind of thing, and do the student teaching. Well, so I was casting around, and I met this guy at George Mason University. This was before anybody knew what George Mason University was. This is before Tony Maiello, before Arnold Gabriel, This was a trailer in the back of the school out in the woods that was the music department. And I met this guy, Dr. Hill, and he says, yeah, sure. He says, you can come in. You have X amount of credits you have to do. He says, but you can probably do it in a year and a half at the most. We'll take you. You got a degree already, so you don't have to audition. We'll be glad. And he was a guy from Massachusetts who was, he'd been a band director. So I could tell right away the guy, he had real experience. So I did. I was able to get in the program. I started it. I spent a year doing classroom work, and then I did my student teaching in Fairfax County, Virginia. And had a really good experience, had a good time, enjoyed it, liked the kids. The kids liked me. The high school kids pranked me. They picked up my car and moved it, the kind of nonsense that high school kids do. So that was how I started down the road as a band director. So I just sort of fell into it. It was funny because I never thought about doing it, coming out of school. I was just interested in jazz and, different kind of things. And the whole thing about being a band director never clicked to me. But there I was, 10 years later, or not quite 10 years, but maybe 8 or 9 years later, now with a wife. And all of a sudden, it made a lot of sense. So I was very fortunate. My wife and I did my student teaching, and it was the middle of the school year. And so my wife and I sat down and we looked at the starting salaries in Washington, D.C. area. And we looked at the starting salaries in Rochester, New York, where she was from. Well, they were about the same. But obviously, it's a heck of a lot more expensive to live in D.C. So we decided, well, let's move up to your parents' house. We'll stay there for a year or two, and hopefully I can get a job in Rochester. And by that time I'd been to Rochester enough times, I realized how good the music scene was up here. And I played with a lot of service band guys when I was in DC. So I knew what that scene was like. And the guys up here were just as good, if not better in some ways than the service band guys. So I felt pretty secure that being a piano player, I could get enough gigs to at least get me started. And that's what happened. We moved up here. I got a long-term sub gig teaching junior high chorus because I was a piano player. So if you were a piano player back then, well, you could teach chorus. Well, I didn't know anything about chorus other than I'd sung it, but I managed to last that year and part of the next year. And by that time, I realized the ropes about being in a school district, that the people inside the district get first crack at any jobs that opened up. So I knew that one of the band directors was going to retire the next year. So I hung on and got through that year, and bam, I ended up being the ninth grade band director the next year. And so the whole thing is I'm still floored by it because I know lots of people that's they know what they want to do, and I just kind of bounced around. And I landed in a great place. It was a growing district, so I was able to grow with it. I always had the benefit. There was always at least one other band teacher because our numbers were fairly large. So I had wonderful mentors who could talk, and back then everybody knew stuff. Like I taught with this guy who was a trombone player for years, but he could recite bassoon trill fingerings and things like that. If you had a question about anything, they really had the knowledge that we don't get as much in depth as nowadays, where they were really trained well. And upstate New York is a wonderful place musically. I mean, all the suburban districts are very strong band programs. Although I did marching band in high school, I was never a huge fan of marching band, and it's that part of it is not so big up here, but that didn't concern me. And our schools, they had jazz bands in the school day, so I was all set. I had a a great in to a great career just by landing up here in Rochester, New York.
Wow, that's remarkable. And so were you at that school for your whole career, or did you end up moving?
I stayed in that district. I taught in 3 different schools, but I always stayed at the middle school level. You know, I was fortunate because my first 4 years of teaching, well, in New York State, you had to have a master's degree. So I was able to get into the Eastman and do my master's there, which was a great, it's a wonderful institution, musically, but also from a standpoint of the people that are there are really intelligent people. And I remember sitting in a music history, philosophy of music lecture and listening to everybody talk and thinking to myself, what the heck am I doing here? There's some mistake. But I was able to, I enjoyed it. I was able to also take jazz arranging courses and some composition courses, and play in a jazz band. And so I got a lot out of it. And so that was, I sort of lost my train of thought here. Where are we going with this?
Oh, you were talking about taking classes at Eastman. But what I was going to ask you is, how did you stay at the same middle school you kind of started off?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I did. So I ended up, I got out of Eastman, and I'd been teaching 4 or 5 years, and I liked where I was. I had a jazz band every day. I had a band every day. And I thought, well, nothing's better. And so I wasn't really thinking about changing everything. And then about my 6th year of teaching, I was looking for a rock chart for the jazz band, and I couldn't find anything. And I had the arrogance to say to myself, well, this isn't so hard. You can do this. So I wrote a jazz band piece. And I took it into the band, and they played it. And it didn't sound bad. And so that got me on the road to composing. And because I became a composer, I realized that if I was going to be a high school band director, I would never have time to do the composing as well. And because I really wanted to be a success as a composer, I wanted to be published. I wanted to be, known. And I said, it was the first time in my life where I realized I couldn't do everything. And I really missed not being able to do high school literature. I would have really enjoyed it. I was a good conductor. I would have picked good repertoire. I would have had a lot of fun with it. But there's no way I could have done both of those things. So I resigned myself to being, middle school, it's a great place to teach because the kids learn so much and they produce so much if you have them for 3 years. And I just made that decision. And it was the right decision to make because otherwise I would not have all these pieces of music that I wrote sitting on my shelf here.
Well, it's interesting. When I talk to composers who are also teachers, the vast majority of them are middle school band directors because I feel like a high school band director, as you mentioned, there's so much of a time commitment for that job.
Well, I would have to agree with that. I mean, I really loved my time teaching the kids, and I loved amateur music making. But I always wanted one part of me to be professional. And I was a much better player than I was a composer. I found that out there's a gentleman in Rochester, his name is Bill Dobbins. And he's a world-renowned jazz pianist and also a great writer. He spent 6 years writing with the GDR Big Band in Cologne. He was their music director back in the 90s. So the guy had real chops. And I took an improv class with him and he didn't like my playing at all. He says, "I don't understand your note choices." And I thought, oh boy. But I also took a jazz arranging class with him, and he really liked the way I wrote. He said, "Larry," he says, "you have the perfect laboratory being a middle school band director." He was into parameters. He says, "You have all the parameters. You can only use a certain amount of range in each instrument. You can only use certain rhythms." He said, "If you can write a good jazz band chart for your jazz band," he said, you really have accomplished something, and you really be a good composer." And that sort of stuck in my head once I got out of grad school. I kept that in the back of my head till I was looking, for that rock chart that I couldn't find. And so I sort of realized that was the great thing about Eastman, was that you learned your limits very quickly, because there was always somebody way scarier at what you were trying to do. And so I naturally gravitated. I tried to find the things that I was good at. And it turned out that arranging and conducting were the better things for me than being a player and being a performer. That seemed to be what I enjoyed most. It seemed to be easy. And I'll never forget, I've been published about 3 or 4 years, and my wife, we were talking about it, and she says, "You're really lucky. You don't stress about this composing thing at all." She says, "You just go up there and do it." And I thought to myself, yeah, she's right. I really don't think about it that much. Well, now that I've written, over, I don't know, somewhere in the high 100s or 175 or close to 200, it's a little harder than it was back then. But it was a relatively easy thing for me to do. It didn't stress me out. I enjoyed it. I felt accomplished. And the kids really loved it when I brought a piece in, because I said, they said, "Did you make this for us?" That was what they always said. "Did you make this?" It wasn't, "Did you write this? Did you compose this? Did you make this for us?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I did. I want to hear you play it." And it was such a positive experience all the way around. And boy, if you're a young composer or a budding composer, I got to say, the best way to do it is write some music and get some people to play it. Because you really hear what you're doing wrong and you hear what you're doing right. And 9 times out of 10, you'll probably be pretty happy with what you've done. Don't make it a big deal. Just when kids come to me, they want to, how do I become a composer? I say, well, do you have a friend that's a really good clarinet player, a really good flute player, or say, write a duet for you and this friend and play it, and just, so you can hear it and you'll learn something from it, because you always do. You always learn something. Shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, no doubt. So, Larry, what I want to know is, so you were a middle school band director for 32 years, and I know I've taught at all different levels, but I'm creeping up on like year 23 now of teaching all around, different levels.
You're almost there.
No, well, but I mean, you were a middle school director. I've only done middle school for like 5 of my years. What did you learn from that? I mean, what advice would you give to someone in their first year or their second year as a middle school band director?
Oh, boy. Well, first of all, everybody thinks they want to be a high school director when they get out of college, right? And that's not necessarily true, because remember, with high school, there's 3 things you got to worry about: cars, girls, and drugs. And, in my experience with middle school, even to the last few years, you really didn't have to worry about that so much. Now, obviously, with all these school shootings and everything else, there were new things to worry about. But in terms of keeping the attention of your students, middle school's a wonderful place, because the kids are excited about everything. And if you can channel that. Now I'm saying things that people said to me. If you can channel that energy, you can really do amazing things. And that was what I found I liked the most about being a middle school teacher, was that I would get these kids in sixth grade. They were pre-adolescent, so they were still little kids. And boy, by the time I got them to eighth grade, they had learned so much. They could, recognize key signatures and play scales and play good music and understand about musical line and dynamics and blend and balance and all the counterpoint and all those kind of things. You just have to look back on it and say, boy, that's really amazing. And I think that's the level that you really see the most growth. So I would advise anybody that's interested in being a music teacher, nothing against any of the other levels, because if you're a good elementary teacher, you've set the tone for a student's entire life in music by teaching them how to put a clarinet together the right way and having a good embouchure and how to hold your fingers on the valves of a trumpet the proper way. That's invaluable. And I always felt blessed that I had excellent elementary teachers who were starting the kids, because I think that's a totally separate skill. And even to the point of identifying what instruments kids should play. And I was always sort of relieved I didn't have to do any of that, because to me, I think that's the hardest thing. But I think for middle school, as with anything, you got to keep it fun. The kids have to have fun. You have to be able to get them to enjoy it, but yet be demanding. I always, if I ever made a mistake, I always owned up to it with the kids. I would always say, "Oh, that's my fault." So you can't BS a kid. They see right through you. And I think the thing is to be comfortable, try to be comfortable in what you do. You have to be yourself. Also, one of the greatest middle school teachers I know is an orchestra teacher. And she is the quietest teacher I've ever heard in my life. She never yells at her kids. Her voice barely raises above a whisper, but she's got those kids in the palm of her hand. Whereas me, I'm yelling and screaming and jumping up and down and running around the band room. I was a big one for getting off the podium and running. If there's a problem in a section, I just go right over to the section, or being in the percussion section. So I would say that that's the most important thing. The second thing is you have to be organized. You have to be over-organized. You cannot do any teaching job, much less a middle school teaching job, without being organized. And, it's like everything else. You got to be able to think on your feet and move. And I think beginning teachers, don't be too hard on yourself, because we all get run over our first year. I mean, there's nobody that comes out of a methods class and their student teaching that really, has a smooth road. It's always a rocky road. Now, that being said, the best thing we have about our job is we have a beginning, a middle, and an end every year. So you can start over. You can start over in the middle of the year. If something's not working right, you can say, "Okay, guys, I know we were doing it this way, but from now on, we're going to do it this way." And the kids will go right along with you because they don't know any better. The other thing I had the benefit of was colleagues. I always had another band colleague, but even more so, my orchestra and my chorus colleagues. I learned a lot observing the orchestra director. I'd been a choral director, so I kind of knew what she was going through. But the orchestra, I learned a lot just watching her as well. And I paid attention. I paid attention to what my colleagues were doing. I asked a lot of questions. I never had a lot of student teachers because I honestly felt I wasn't good enough to have a student teacher. I know that sounds maybe weird, but because I knew teachers that, they'd be teaching 2 years and all of a sudden they'd start getting a cooperating teacher. They'd be the cooperating teacher. They get a student teacher every year. And I was like, I'm not good. I don't know enough to do that. I wouldn't feel good enough. And I think I may be unusual in that way. But I really felt it was if you're going to take a student teacher, I only had a couple in my time, and they both did very well. But I think having the benefit of colleagues and learning from them, I was able to pick up things if I had a question. I mean, to this day, so I'm a conductor with the New Horizons. New Horizons, the wonderful thing about it that Roy decided early on was that every ensemble should have 2 directors. So if one of the director wants to take a trip or go on vacation, they could do that. Because, let's face it, you'll be retired. So you want to do those kind of things. Well, I still to this day, the gentleman that I co-direct with, Dr. Bruce Burrett, I ask him, Bruce, how would you conduct this passage, or how would you do this? And I observe him when he conducts and how he deals. He's particularly good with lyrical music, although he's good with everything, but he's very good with, pulling out the inner voices and that. And I've learned so much in 2 years just with him. So I think you have to be inquisitive, and you have to not be afraid to admit that you don't need things. And I think, people don't feel secure. They feel like they're not competent if you ask questions. And I mean, I would ask the kids, and it was so funny. I'd always make jokes with the kids about, my trumpet players. After 6th grade, I wouldn't play with them anymore. And they'd say, Mr. Neeck, how come you don't play along with us anymore? And I said, do you really have to ask that question? And they'd laugh because they knew they were better than me already, So, but I wasn't ashamed to admit it. I was, and so I think you have to be secure in yourself. You have to do it your way. But there's so many opportunities to learn and to grow if you pay attention.
So, Larry, what was the change like? You mentioned that you went in 2000, your school went from a junior high 7 through 9 to a middle school 6 through 8. What was that change like? How did you have to change your teaching?
On the top end, I had a 9th grade band. The kids were started in 4th grade in my district.
Oh, nice.
So 5 years later, guess, what kind of music I was doing with them. I mean, I was doing really good stuff with them. And, that was a gas because they really could play in tune. They were getting good at tuning themselves. We could do technically challenging stuff. So that went away. On the other end, the kids, you had to think much simpler with them. And I think the way I first thought of it was, all these kids are coming to me, and I had about 5 feeder schools coming in. So I would have a big group. It was split in 2 with about 60, 65 kids in each group. And so they were like each in their own little world. And they'd been taught differently from 5 other teachers. And my first year with them was always about getting them to be a band, to become a group. So they weren't just themselves playing the same, their song, that they were actually doing it as a band and understanding the different parts of the band, and that it just wasn't about them. And so that really was the biggest change. You had to really simplify. On the other hand, the 6th graders were so much fun because they were so gullible. You could jerk their chain so easily, and they loved it. They loved it when when you picked on them or in a nice way. I'm talking about, you kind of, you goofed around. I goofed around with them. I learned to be a kid. That was the first time I ever had a band do a wave in a rehearsal. They were just, we got to the end of the rehearsal. We had 5 minutes left. I said, okay, put your instruments away. We're going to do the wave. Oh my God, you'd think that would be the greatest thing that ever happened in the world. And we did. We did the wave, and we did the slow motion wave, and we did the wave where we talked fast, and we did the wave where we talked slowly. And, I spent 5 minutes with them, but just establishing that rapport with those kids, I had them. I had them from there on. I never had to do anything else to get them to pay attention to me. They liked me. They see I have fun, but they also knew that I knew my stuff, and that when it was time to work, because I would say, okay, look, we have to figure this out today. We're going to take 15 minutes now, and if you're not playing, you have to sit quiet or finger your part. And I've got to work with this section on this, because otherwise we're not going to be able to play this piece. And just by being matter of fact and explaining them to that, and knowing that at some point we would have fun, I was able to get done what needed to be done, and yet not do it in sit down, be quiet, or in that kind of a way. And it's just a way of, you just had to relate to them differently. And that was a real change.
Yeah, I like the term matter of fact, because if there's just no other way to be, then that's what they're going to be.
That you're absolutely right. This is how we do it. And I think the other thing I always did, I never thought of myself as a teacher. I thought of myself as the conductor of the band. And I tried to instill that in the kids, like, you're musicians, you're not music students, you're musicians. This is how musicians do things, and we're going to do things the way musicians do them. And, that professionalized it in a way that I don't think it's possible to do in a math class or a science class or an English class, or at least not in the same way. And that's where we have an advantage over the so-called core classes.
What level were they coming into you at sixth grade? Were they coming in?
Well, they had a group lesson once a week, and they had one band rehearsal once a week.
So you're like at the second method book, basically.
Pretty basic. So I spent a lot of time just teaching rhythms, doing, counting, clapping, simple things. We worked a lot on tone, about filling their instrument up with it. That's really the hardest thing. And getting them to fill their instruments, because they're still growing. You can't monkey around so much with tuning. You're basically getting what they can give you.
Yeah. Well, until their tone,
you've got to make it work.
Until they have good tone, they can't tune, really. So were you using a method book, or were you teaching from literature?
No, we did. We used the Bellwin method. It's an old traditional method, but what I liked about it is each page had like a technical exercise, a tone exercise, and then etudes to play. And some of the etudes were made up, and some of the etudes were, like classical repertoire, things of that nature. And we worked from that. We also obviously worked on band music, although we tried not to focus on the band music in the lessons as much. I think that earlier in my career, kids would actually go home and practice what I was having them do. Much later in my career, I thought it was a real problem, because the kids were no longer independent. I had to explain to them. I actually would explain to them, okay, do this for 5 minutes, do this for 5 minutes, do this for 5 minutes, work on this and this, where I would go through the lesson and tell them exactly what they had to do. Because everything is so sports oriented now, and you're being coached from the time you're 4 years old. You're not an independent thinker. When I was first starting out, if a kid came in unprepared for the lesson, or they had a problem, I could just say, look, you have to go home and work on that. Go do it. And they would know how to do that. Kids today don't. I think that's in part why we have programs like Smart Music to really assist the kids in that, because, and I don't have any problem with Smart Music, but it takes away, unfortunately, the independence. And I always used to say to the kids, look, the importance of music, of studying an instrument, is not so much that you're learning music. You're learning skills that you can apply to anything the rest of your life. How to solve a problem. When you get a job, your boss is going to want your work done. He or she's not going to tell you how you're going to do it. You have to figure that out. And I said, that's what you're doing now by practicing. You're figuring out how to fix things.
So Larry, let's talk about your composition stuff. So I was at the dinner at Midwest this year where you were presented with the Barnhouse Barney Award. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. So for those who are listening, Barnhouse gives out an award called a Barney. And I don't know how many they've given out, but you're one of a very select few.
Yeah, I think they've recognized their either composers or they've recognized some dealers that had outstanding business for them over the years, and then I know Andy Clark has one. But yeah, I'm in rather rarefied air, which has always been in some ways a difficulty for me because, I started out as a jazz writer and I really didn't have to compete with anybody except for Paul Clark, who's an icon as a jazz writer. But when it came to writing concert band music, I had James Swearingen, David Schaefer, Alfred Reed, Ed Huckabee, and later on Robert Smith, and so I was always coming up against that and saying, what can I write that they'll take that'll make me look different from these other really iconic people. Iconic writers, and so those are the people who have gotten that Barney Award. So I really I was totally flabbergasted that I got that. It was a great moment. On the other hand, I have written over 175 over 175 pieces published by C.L. Barnhouse. And so I've done my part. I've made the company money over the last 20, 25, 26 years. So I don't feel too bad about taking it.
I mentioned to you, I think I played one of your jazz charts when I was a high school jazz director. When did you make the transition to writing concert band music? Because I know you talked about that rock chart you wrote.
Yeah, well, I did. That was serendipity. There's a guy that lives down the street from me named Howard Rowe. And you probably know the name of Howard Rowe. Howard Rowe is a jazz composer who writes for Barnhouse, or he wrote for Barnhouse. He's not doing any writing anymore. And Howard Rowe was a teacher here in Rochester, a trumpet player. And so I took him that one jazz chart I wrote, and I said, hey, do you think I could get it published? And if you think so, what would you recommend I do? And so he looked it over and he said, yeah, this is like something that he says even Barnhouse might be interested in it. But he says, take it over to Bruce Bush. This is the Bruce Bush I talked about earlier with you off the air. Bruce works for Hal Leonard Publications, but in another life, he ran a sheet music company, both in Syracuse and Rochester, New York. And he, of course, knew the people at all the publishers. And I took it to him, and he says, you know what? He says, you could send it to Candor, which, again, is an upstate New York company that's published a lot of jazz music. He says, but the rock tune's pretty good. He says, why don't you, he says, send this in to Andy Clark at Barnhouse. And what I'll do is you tell me when you send it in, and I'll call him like a week later and ask him to really take a look at it. So he did that for me. So Bruce, he's so funny when he introduces me at Midwest to his fellow people at Hal Leonard. He says this guy's the enemy, because we're at different publishers, and it's funny. He does it as a joke, but so we took this. So I sent it to Barnhouse, and it took a long time. But I told him, I said, and Bruce, the one thing Bruce said, which is advice I give anybody submitting, submit your best stuff, your best one or two. That's it. To one publisher. Don't shotgun it. Don't send it out to anybody else. And because I made a point of telling the Barnhouse people, I said, I'm sending this. I've only sent this to you. And only this one, I think I sent them 2 charts, but I figured I'd give them one they could turn down. And so they ended up taking it. And of course, I was thrilled. It was a big deal. All the music teachers around here made a big deal about it. And they went out and bought my chart. And February came around, and I got a check for $1,200. And I was like, whoa, this is like, this is way more than the money I make in playing in the wedding band. I got to get serious about this. So the next year I wrote 3 charts and sent them all in thinking, maybe they'll take 1, or if I'm lucky 2. And they called me back and said, yeah, we like them all. We're going to take them all. And so that was how I got started as a jazz writer. And the second year that I published, I had a tune called Just Before I Close My Eyes, which was a ballad. And it featured either an alto sax or a trumpet. And the thing was a hit. I sold a boatload of them. And it put me on the map as a jazz writer. And so I was happy. I was getting jazz stuff. But what I realized was that not every school had a jazz band, but every school had a band. And I was ambitious. I wanted to be published. And I looked at the stable of writers that Barnhouse had, which, as I said before, these were, icons in the profession. So I started messing around trying to get some. I started writing some concert band stuff. It took me a long time to understand what they were looking at, and this is the thing about becoming a successful composer. You have to understand what will sell. What your company, what will sell if you're affiliated with a company or if you're not, what will sell? Because you've always looked at it as, I have this blank sheet of paper and these wonderful musical ideas. I put them down on paper and somebody will publish me. And that's not the way it works, as you well know, Mark. You have to have something that the publisher feels they can take a chance on you, print it up, invest money in you, make back that money, and make back money for a number of years to recoup their costs and hopefully even make a little more to make a profit. And it took me about 6 or 7 years of sending lousy charts in to them. And finally, one year, Andy Clark took pity on me. And he called me up. He says, Larry, we need a lyrical song for a concert band, for the Command series. And those of you that know Barnhouse music, Command series is like their bread and butter. That's anything from middle school to easy high school. They probably sold the most pieces of music ever in that series. And he said to me, he says, I said, well, what do you want? He says, well, we want something, maybe a trumpet feature would be a good idea. He says, go listen to this piece that Ed Huckabee did about 10 years ago and try to do something like that. So I did. And he put me on a deadline because this was sort of the end. And so I had about 3.5, 4 weeks to write it. And I did a nice recording of it, because back then we had to do demos for all the music we sent in. So I got one of the younger players in the Rochester Philharmonic Orchestra, a guy named Herb Smith, who's a wonderful musician, plays jazz and legit, but is a member of the Rochester Philharmonic. Also has the Gateways Brass Quintet that he reps for. He's sponsored by Consumer. And I got him in to play it, and Herb just nailed it. It was beautiful. And then everybody was like, yeah, that was a pretty nice sounding piece. So I threw that in with my jazz stuff, sent it in, and I got published. And so I thought, okay, here we go. So the next year I did another one, only this was more, you could do more different things. So then I started thinking, okay, so everybody's, Jim Swearingen does his ABA piece. Ed Huckabee does his thing with his mixed meters. David Schaefer will have a march and another ABA piece. What can I do? And I thought, I'll do a patriotic tune. And I was able to get one of my colleagues in Webster had taken his band to Washington, D.C., and he wanted to do like a multimedia thing with pictures from that on the screen, and he needed some patriotic music. So he said, "Hey, will you write me a patriotic piece?" So that's what I did, and of course we did it at the spring concert. It was a big hit, and I sent that into Barnhouse, and they took that. So that sort of got me going. In terms, I looked for a niche that wasn't filled by somebody else in the company. And I think that that's a good way to approach things, because what publishing companies, I'm talking about traditional publishing companies now, they're looking for somebody that's unique. Their music has to fit within the umbrella of the type of music that they publish. But they don't want to hear another Robert Smith, or they don't want to hear another James Swearingen. They want a unique voice. And sometimes one way to do that, at least the way that worked for me, was to write something that was different enough, but also was in a particular sort of genre that wasn't being as covered by everybody else. And that really was how I got my start. And from there on, I got a couple commissions, so I had to produce some music. I started getting ideas. I finally figured out what they wanted, and then they started taking, regular concert band pieces from me. And the regular concert band pieces sold. People bought them, because that's the bottom line. And I came up with this piece, Midnight Escape, which was in 5/4, which I did in 3/2 because it seemed to look better on the page. And that was one piece that did real well. And then I did an arrangement of a couple Irish tunes called Under an Irish Sky. And from then on, I was my own guy. I was my own person as a composer. I had my own identity. But that was how I got there. It was not easy. And I scratched my head trying to figure out what they wanted. And it just took time and really paying attention.
Remember your first term of teaching? Learning all the skills that you don't get taught in music school? Managing a transitioning culture in your classroom? Finding out that you have to teach guitar this term? During those early years, we found out that leaning on a community of music educators was important, not only for building that knowledge in ourselves, but also maintaining enough sanity to serve the students right in front of us. Amused is a podcast centered around a community of music teachers. Between the four of us, we teach choir, band, orchestra, general, jazz, and marching band at the elementary through collegiate levels. We certainly don't have all the answers, but you're welcome to listen in while we try to find them. Join us while we work through the challenges of music teaching and celebrate the joy of bringing music making into the lives of young people. In each episode, you'll hear stories, both good and bad, about that week of teaching, and we'll try and tackle an issue that one of us is struggling with. Something we're all taught is that music brings people together, but being the only teacher in your subject at a site can be really isolating. We think everyone ought to be a part of a community, and you're welcome to come join ours. Episodes come out on Wednesdays during the school year, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at amusedcast.org.
So, Larry, I ask all of my guests a group of questions at the end of each interview. And so they're kind of broad philosophical questions that address some of the big issues in our band world. And so the first one of these is, where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition?
When I think of competition, I think of competing against myself. You certainly can observe how other groups or other people do things. For instance, being a part of Barnhouse and getting to know people like Ed Huckabee and David Schaefer and Jim Swearingen and Rob Romaine, I want to bring my A game to whatever I do. So in a sense, I'm competing against them. But on the other hand, I want to do something better than I did it before. And I had the same philosophy with my bands. When we went to competition, it wasn't to compete against other bands. It was to compete to see how well we could do. And could we do better than we did the previous year? Or if we did great, could we continue to do better? And I always felt that the judges' comments were the most important thing. And I would always read them. And it would always really tick me off when I got a judge who really didn't offer a lot of comments, because that was what I really wanted. And we have a wonderful thing here in New York called NYSSMA, New York State School Music Association. And they sponsor solo festivals around the state. And they have a category that if you're working on a piece but you really don't want to be graded on it, you just want comments, it's called festival. And you can just go and perform your piece for a judge, and you will get comments on that. And I always thought, let's say you've really stretched yourself. You went to do that level 6 solo and you really weren't quite ready for it. And you don't want to get trashed. But on the other hand, you put a lot of time into it. And, hopefully you could get some valuable comments from the judge, from an impartial person who's hearing you, who hasn't heard you every day like your regular teacher. So that's really the way I feel about competition. I think there's competition in everything. But I believe if you can make it inner-directed as opposed to, competing against yourself as opposed to beating someone else, I think that's the way to go. It's the more productive way to go. And it's a way in which you can continue to grow. It doesn't stop with winning. It's like, okay, I did that great. It's the same thing. Every time I go to do an all-county or conduct a festival band, or every time I go to write a new piece, well, that last piece was pretty good. I better be able to do it again, or is there a way I can make it even better? And that's my approach.
One of the problems, or one of the questions that many band directors struggle with is their work-life balance. How did you achieve a work-life balance, or did you?
I do one thing that has nothing to do with music, and that's sailing. I race sailboats.
Oh, wow.
I have a J22. It's a 22-foot racing sailboat. I stumbled into sailing in my 40s. I'd done a little bit of sailing just being a passenger on a boat, and I was always fascinated by it. And when I turned 40, I realized if I didn't buy a boat soon, I'd never do it. So I went out and bought a boat. And we have, in this area, in addition to the Great Lake of Ontario, we have smaller lakes that they're not super small, but they're called the Finger Lakes. And they provide beautiful scenic. They're glacial lakes. It's our wine country here in upstate New York. It's where all the good Rieslings come from. And so I started sailing, and I met a guy that had the same boat as me. And because I was going to buy a boat, and the company said, hey, well, there's this guy who lives near you, has one. They didn't, it wasn't, they didn't sell through dealers. They sold direct from the factory. So I met him. He says, hey, if you get the boat, we'll go sailing together. We'll learn. So I made a new friend. I bought the boat. I started sailing around. And after a few years, he had a friend that actually his cousin was the president of the yacht club down in Canandaigua, which is the lake I sail on, Lake Canandaigua. And so we joined the yacht club, and because it was really set up for sailors, and we started sailing. And then we started noticing that there were sailboats that raced, and the guys who raced and the women who raced, they could make their boat go anywhere they wanted it to. We couldn't do that. So we said, hey, maybe we should get involved in this. So you get involved, you start crewing. You get on a racing boat, and you learn about, and there's all these archaic things. There's signals, whistles, and horns, and flags, and different courses. And I started doing it, and I realized this is the one thing you do that has nothing to do with music, that you have no time to think about music because you're too busy doing something else. This is a good thing. So I discovered it by mistake. I think that people in our business, in the music education business, we try to do way too much. And I'm very fortunate that I found this outlet, that it's because it totally takes me away from band, because I am like everybody else. I'm 24/7 music. I just am. I try to shut it down by 6 o'clock at night. and I usually do. I'm usually pretty good about that, unless, obviously if I have a concert. But I think we're really driven. I think it's the nature of our business. If you're going to be good at it, you have to put the time in, and the time means staying after school to help kids with solos and providing opportunities for your better kids and helping the kids that need the extra help. And if you're going to do it right, that's what you have to do. And it just takes a heck of a lot of time. So I would say if you can find one thing that isn't music, that's a good thing. The other thing is have a professional musical outlet. If you're a clarinet player, find a good group to play with, or form a chamber music group, or something that makes you feel like an adult and that you actually are a practicing musician. I always had that with my composing. I felt very fortunate about that. And then, I still play once a week in a big band just to make sure I'm still reading the music and my fingers work a little bit. So those are my two approaches to that.
All right, Larry, this is a big question, and everyone answers it a little bit different, but there are some answers that are common throughout all of the interviews. And so what are the challenges facing music education and band, and how can we best meet them?
Well, the biggest challenge is that kids don't know how to learn anymore. And kids don't want to take time to learn. And their parents don't want them to take time to learn. I think the thing is that in order to not make music be a frill, you have to balance, again, going back to fun, you have to make it enjoyable, but it has to have something of value. People have to recognize that it's a good thing. And I think that has to do with having a quality program. It's getting harder and harder to have quality programs because of the emphasis on accelerated classes and advanced placement classes and sports. And I think it's very difficult for anybody, any music teacher nowadays, to provide a good program, because your time is being whittled away. The kids that need your most help are being pulled out for special services. Your advanced kids are the ones that are taking all the AP courses. And many kids are really involved in not just one sport, but 2 or 3 at a time. And I don't have an answer for that. I think it's a commentary on our society in general. What I would say, though, is that good programs do thrive. They continue to thrive. There's obviously a lot of pieces to having a good program. If you have a good high school program, you can thank your middle school and your elementary teachers that you have it, because that's where it starts. I would love to see us put more into the earlier years, give kids more music, more art. I don't see that happening. I'm glad to see that the whole charter school thing is starting to turn in a different direction. They're starting to be questioned on the validity of what they're doing. And if we remember, the charter schools were established to be laboratories for good practices, not to take the place of traditional schools. If we can move back in that direction, I think that will help us as well. But it's a big challenge. Everything is so available 24/7. And if you're bored, you could just change your web page or change your channel. And that's really what we're competing with. I think you as a music educator have to demonstrate your competence and the value of what you're doing to both the kids and the parents. And that's not easy to do, but that's what you have to try to do, and maintain as good a program as you possibly can, because you are giving kids something that they're not getting anywhere else in school, that they will not get in later life for the most part, and that you never know who the next music teacher or musician will be who comes out of your band. I have, in my district, one of the elementary teachers was my former student. And it's just like, and you never know. You're planting seeds, especially if you're teaching, elementary or middle school. You never know. So you just have to try to do the best you can. And you're not going to be able to do it perfect. You just got to do it in the best way. We have a saying in New Horizons, your best is good enough. And that's what you have to do. You can't control, there's so much you can't control. Don't drive yourself crazy over it. Just try to do the best you can. Be true to your beliefs. Keep fighting the fight.
Larry, if I could give you a time machine and set it to the day of your high school graduation, what would you tell yourself?
Pay attention, stupid. Watch what's going on. Think about things more. Oh my God. Pay attention.
All right,
honestly,
fair enough.
I was all over the place. It was like, I really, boy, the saying, youth is wasted on the young. I mean, there was a reason that's been around for 4,000 years, because it's true.
All right, Larry, if you could plan it out, what would be the final work by someone else that you'd like to conduct or play or hear?
I wouldn't mind conducting a symphony orchestra and a theme to Back to the Future by Alan Silvestri, because it's short, but it's a beautifully crafted piece of music. Something like that. Being able to conduct symphonic dances from West Side Story. Pick a piece. I mean, Symphonic Metamorphosis by Paul Hindemith. Just pick. I mean, how could I even being able to conduct the Duke Ellington Orchestra at its height? It's like, oh my God, there's so many things. I can't that would be the quality of what I would be shooting to do. Let's put it that way.
So, Larry, this is a question that wasn't on the list, but I like to ask the composers the question: if you could steer the listeners to one piece of yours that you'd want them to hear, what piece would you want them to kind of start with? Like, they don't know Larry Neeck. What do you want them to listen to?
I'm very proud of a piece that's called the Glacier Express.
Okay, that's a grade 3,
and,
right?
It's a grade 3.5. It's a longer piece. But I did a lot of things. There's a lot of beautiful music in that, if I say so myself. It covers a lot of ground. It represents, I think, what I do best, which is melody. And it has very special meaning to me because I was writing it as my daughter was auditioning to go to college. And so I did a fair amount of it in hotel rooms, taking her around to different schools. She's an actress. She's a Broadway actress. And so we went around to, places like Cincinnati and Carnegie Mellon and NYU. And I was under a time deadline, so I was really cranking it out. It was for it was a commission piece, and I had to get it done. And some of the music in there, I thought, is really beautiful. And I remember one of my colleagues heard some of it, and he said, he says, you've been able to take what you're doing in your jazz music, and now you've incorporated it into your concert band music as well, the language that you use. And I thought, wow, I did that. That was really, if I did that, I think I did something good. So that's a piece I'm very proud of, that I think it covers a lot of ground and shows a lot of different things that I do.
All right, Larry, is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
Well, I will have new music being published by Barnhouse, which will be out next June and July. Please go to the Barnhouse website and click on my composer page, and you will see everything new there as well as everything old, or you can find everything old. That I really, I do certain things around the country from time to time. I don't have anything in the immediate future, but I do have a website, which I'm in the process of updating. It's www.larryneeck.com. The Neeck is spelled Neeck, and you're welcome to visit that. I can be contacted through that website or through the Barnhouse website. It's interesting in festival season. I get a lot of emails from directors asking me, well, what did you mean by this? Or is there a mistake in this music and in this particular part? Did you want the tambourine to play here too? I'm always happy to answer those kind of questions. I do not sit on emails. I try to respond to them quickly, and sometimes I'm able to even do it immediately. So if you have a question about any of my pieces, if you would like me to come and work with your band, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. I do Skype sessions. If you're doing one of my pieces, feel free to contact me. I just generally do that. I don't charge for that. If you'd like to commission me, I've done numerous commissions over the years, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that too.
All right, Larry, how can people get in touch with you?
Well, again, the easiest way is either through barnhouse.com, and just go to my composer page, and there's a contact right there. Or you can go to my website, www.larryneeck.com, and there's a contact page right there. I will get the email, and I'll get right back to you.
Excellent. Larry, thank you so much for your time.
Mark, I really want to thank you. I've never done a podcast before. This has been a very enjoyable experience, and I really appreciate you inviting me to do this. Thank you so much.